Hello, this is Randy with Excel for Freelancers, and welcome to part 2 of the Data Import Manager. We've got a lot more to cover in this amazing application. Today we're going to go over the destination details, how to pull up specific destination files, and how to get those mapped out and customized exactly as you want. So we have tons to cover, and we're going to try to get to as much as possible in this training. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. All right, thanks so much for joining us on this part 2 of the Data Import Manager. This is part 2, so if you haven't quite seen part 1, you will want to do that first. I've included the link to part 1 down in the description below, so make sure you go ahead and check that out. That's very important because we're going to take right off from where we left off previously. In fact, in part 1 we covered a few things. We covered how to specifically select on our different parts, 4 different parts. We covered how to change the row views and hide certain rows and show certain rows. We also covered how to change the button look and feel of the buttons by changing the formats and changing the font color on the selected. So we covered that. We also covered all of the data source details, how to browse for a specific source and how to automatically insert sheets and how to create the sheets automatically based on the sheets within that source. We've also listed how to automate the first row of data along with the first column and the last row of the last column and the import details. So we covered all of that in the first part 1. So now we're going to move on to the destination. And of course, in the destination part of it, what we're doing is we're going to be browsing for a destination where we look for the specific destination, if there is a destination, or perhaps we want to a new workbook. We have a new workbook option. In the destination, once one is selected, again, just as we did in the source, we have the ability to select from specific sheets, or we've got a brand new one. We also have the ability to add a new sheet onto the destination, and we have the ability to give that new sheet a name so that when we do import the details into that brand new sheet, we automatically can create a name for that new sheet as well. Again, on this new sheet, we also have the ability to put the first row of data in the first column. And of course, if it is an existing sheet, we have sheet 2 here. So we have the ability to select between a specific sheet, or if there's an existing, we also have the ability to update whether it's headers. And an amazing, if it's an existing sheet, we have the ability to either add to the existing data or replace the existing data. So we've got a lot to cover on that. For example, let's say our test destination data, we had some sheets and we have our data already in a destination such as this destination here. On sheet 4, we have products here, we have different, maybe we want to add on to this, maybe we don't want to replace it, but we want to actually add on to this. So we have the ability to add on or to replace the existing data. We've got that option in the destination. We have the option to add it on any one of the sheets or even create a new sheet in our destination. We've got a lot of options. If it's a new workbook, we have the ability to give that new workbook a file name for the new workbook, and we have the ability to assign either one of the first 3 sheets to the new workbook, so we can put it on a sheet 2 if we wanted on that new workbook. And of course, we have the ability to include the headers and specifically a row. We can specify a row where we want the first row of data and a column. So if we want that to appear in the first data to appear in column C, it would be column 3. So we've got that. So we've got a lot of conditional formatting that we're using to hide and show content based on certain conditions. So we're going to show all that to you. If we do have time, we're going to try to get to some of the data mapping, the data format, which allows us to map certain files and formats. So we've got that to cover. All right, let's get to it. We have the first thing on our destination is we have the ability to use an existing workbook or to import a new workbook. If it's a new workbook, there's going to be nothing to browse for, right? But if it's an existing workbook, we do have the ability to browse. So the first thing we're going to do is run a macro based on this, and that's going to browse for a new workbook or hide some contents based on that. So let's take a look at that. Once again, I've created a group for this. In fact, this is called step 2 group, step 2 group. This is a group, and inside this group we have various buttons like browse for destination, previous, next. We also have these 2 options here. We have an option group. Those option groups are included in here. And in this option group, what I've done is I've just created the option without any text because I want the text to match exactly the same font and size as we do for the rest of them. So I've just left the text blank for this option and included that. And to get this option, all we would do is go into the developers. We would insert right here. We have what's called an option button, form control option button. So that is that. We've got 2 option buttons. And when we take a look into this, we're going to right click on the format control. We'll see that the B4 is the cell that's linked, B4. That is there. And that number B4 is either going to be 1 or 2. 1 and 2. So if we select import a new workup, this is going to be 2. If we use an existing workbook, this is going to be 1. So B4 changes because both of these are linked to the same cell. Now, as you can see, there's a lot running on when we select either of these. So let's take a look at the macros that we're running to change that. So if we right-click a specific option, we right-click assign macro, we can see that we have a macro called use existing workbook. We have one macro called use existing workbook, and we have another macro for this one called use new workbook. Those are the 2 macros that we're going to be focused on initially, use new workbook and use existing workbook. So into the VBA we go, into the developers, Alt F11 will get you there. So we can pull that up right now. And once we see we have destination macros here, we've got a module called destination macros. And inside this, we have various macros. We have browse for destination. We'll get to that. We have use new workbook. We have use existing workbook. These are the 2. And we have get destination data. We're going to go over all of these macros. So the first one we have that I wanted to use new workbook. Now, when we use a new workbook, there's a few settings that I want to do. The first thing is I want to clear some information. I want to clear any existing content. So if we have a new, for example, let's say we have selected a new workbook. Let's say we have a new workbook. If there's any destination file here, E28 through J28, or we have E29 through F, this information we want to be cleared because that's based. So for example, if we've browsed for a destination and we have a destination workbook here, as you'll see, this information is included here, and I want to erase that. So when we use a new workbook, I want to make sure that this information that pertains to a specific workbook that we've already selected, I want to make sure that is gone. We want to clear that out because we're using a new workbook. So not only do I want to do that, but I also want to set the destination just for new workbook. I want to set that. I may allow the user to browse for a specific location in the future. Maybe we can automate what location that's saved in. So if we save that destination automatically, maybe we can have a default location. So that's something we can consider. Let me know in the comments below if that's something you want to see. We can also set the file name, test file name. So we can set a file name for that. And I think that's not programmed in yet as far as the save. So once we run the import and summary, we want to save this file. That's something I'll add in the future, but I want to make sure that to give the user the ability to save the file under a specific name. So I think that's kind of important. And of course, every new workbook that you create, when we create a new workbook, there's always 3 sheets that we have to choose from. So I've given the user those 3 same choices, sheets 1, 2, or 3. So when we click new workbook, you see there's a lot that changes here. So let's go over those details and everything that we change when we click on the new workbook. Back into the VBA code. So we're going to clear some cells out. A65, this is the mapping data. So we want to clear those out. Remember we went over in the previous episode, clear the mapping data. Once again, let's review that. When we have mapped out, let's close the source for now. We don't need that open. When we have mapping data, right, there's certain mapping data that we have all over here. So we want to make sure that that mapping data is cleared out. So that's very, very important. We don't, because that mapping data is based on a specific destination and a specific source. So when we select a new source or we select a new destination, we want to make sure that's cleared out. So D65 through J and whatever rows, we want to clear that out. So that's very, very important. When we use an existing workbook, and we have the mapping details, we want to make sure it's cleared out, right? So it's cleared out. So when we select a new workbook and we click destination, we want to be able to run a brand new map, and we click on the map data, we want to run that new map there. So important to clear those cells out. So that's also cleared out when we select a new workbook. What else are we doing? Well, the first thing I want to set the formats on the mapping data back to general. The formats do change. If you look here under the, if we click here, we see that there's different formats. For example, this has a, let's drop this down a little bit and go to home. This has a custom format, date format, currency format. So these formats change based on the type of data in the mapping. So what I want to do is I want to return these all to general. When we clear out the data here, we also want to make sure that we clear the formats, and we also, as you can see, we have certain data validations. I want to clear those out because all of this, these formats, this data validation are all based on specific data. So it's cleared out because the data could be different each time. So we want to do that. So we want to clear out the validations. We want to set these back to general. So like this one's general. We want to set them all back to general. So we do that in the code. And then also B8 and I29 equals sheet 1. B8 and I29 equals sheet 1. Why is that? Well, if you remember, let's close this out. Okay, so if you remember correctly, here now we have on the destination, we also have, let's unhide this so we can see that. We have our destination sheets. Our destination sheets are now located here. So when I have a brand new workbook, let's select import a new workbook. What I want to do is I want to set the default here into I29. I want to set the default to sheet 1. I also want to put sheet 1 here because I want to give the user 3 different choices. And this is a dynamic named range. And that named range is also based on this drop-down list. Let's take a look at that. When we click into data validation, we can see that it's the destination worksheet list. And when we highlight that, we'll see that it's the first 3. Now, that's a dynamic named range, just as we did with source sheets in part 1. So let's take a look like that dynamic name range into the formulas, the name manager, and we see here we have destination worksheet. Let's increase that destination worksheet list. So when we tab over that, again, we see the same list. And that's an offset. Using an offset, of course, we're going to start with 7, and we're going to include the headers just in case there's no data. We don't want an error on that named range. We're going to start with 1 row down, 1 row down. That formula starts in 7, but the actual counting starts in 1 column below that, which is actually 8. We're going to count everything between B7 and B34, and then we're going to subtract 1 because we don't really want to include 7 here. We want to include everything less. That is going to give us the 3 below, sheet 1, 2, 3. But as we add from that, as we add 1 there, if there's 1 there, then when we go into the name manager, you will see the destination. It's automatically included in that. When you see the dancing ants there, it's included in that. And that gives us the ability to add sheets based on whatever is in. Of course, a new workbook is just going to have 3, but that does give us the ability to add it dynamically to this drop-down list. Okay, but of course new workbooks will just have sheets 1, sheet 2, and sheet 3. So new workbook, we're going to assign B8 and I29 sheet 1 because it's going to default to sheet, and then I want to make sure that I add sheet 2 and sheet 3 here to give the user those 3 options to choose from for a new workbook. So that's just what we've done here in the code. B8, I29 sheet 1, B9 and B10 sheet 2 and 3. So we have those 2 options. E28 is the new workbook. That E28 is the file name, the long file name. We've given it the new workbook just so that we clear out anything that might have gone there before, and we're able to show that we have the new workbook. All right, let's close these out, and we'll close this one out just so we're focused on one file at a time. Okay, so back into the destination. So E28 gets that new workbook text right here. And we've created a conditional formatting for this. When we go into the home and conditional formatting and manage rules, I've created a conditional formatting because this is not user entered. This is not, so I just put this specific new workbook because it's kind of automated. And I've put, when we edit this rule, we see that any specific text containing new workbook is going to get this blue font, just so we can differentiate it, clearly differentiate it between a file path of an existing workbook and a new workbook. So new workbook, it gets that text, which is the blue font, and then the light blue background. So we've given it that. And next up, I want to also I-28 default import to sheet 1. All right, we don't need that. No problem for that. F31, we want to make sure that is true. F31 is 2. Why is that? We're going to set the first row of data to 2. That's just the default. For a new workbook, I want to set the first row of data, assuming that you have header rows maybe in the first row. I'm going to set the first row of data to 2. That's just the default, so that if you have header rows, it's going to automatically set that. And the first column of data to 1. So we're going to set those as default for new workbooks. The first column of data to column 1, the first row of data to row 2. And next up, we want to set B61. We want to reset the mapping data as incomplete. And the reason we do this is when I run this code, I want to make sure that the user does not skip the mapping data. I want to make sure that when they try to import and they click run import, we're going to set that the data mapping must be done. So basically what that does is it resets the data mapping. So we want to make sure that they don't skip a step. So that's really important. And so that's why we set the data mapping to false. And I'll go over that in a little bit more detail a little bit later on. So just so you know, we want to make sure that all the steps run in the right process. And we do that by setting this to false. The next up, I want to set the Shapes Destination Workbook button to false. If they've selected a new workbook, we don't need to browse import a new workbook. When we click import a new workbook, we want to make sure that there's no button to import, because either it's an existing workbook where they're going to be able to browse for it, or a new workbook where it's going to be hidden. So when we have a new workbook, I want to make sure that this button, browse for destination workbook, the name I've given it to is destination workbook button, I want to make sure that is hidden. And of course, we're going to display that when we click existing workbook. We're going to hide it when we click new workbook. So I want to make sure that that button is not visible, and we can do that with Shapes Destination Workbook visible equals false. All right, moving on. We've covered the new workbook, but what about when we use an existing workbook? We're going to do pretty much just the opposite of a few things. The first thing I want to do, of course, is show that button. I want to show the destination workbook. That's important. I also want to clear all the fields associated with the workbook, because we're going to put in brand new fields. So when I click that, I want to make sure that any type of data that was in here is automatically cleared out. Of course, there's no data, but a certain amount of data is cleared, and I want to make sure we do that. There's also, when we have an existing workbook, we need to know the last row of data and the last column of data, because it's going to be an existing workbook. The only way that we would not have this is if it is an existing workbook. Let's just pull in the workbook. If it is an existing workbook, but we have let's say it's an existing workbook, we already have data here. So the last row of data in this sheet is 21, the last column is 10. Now these are very, very important, so we need to clear all those out and reset those. Of course, if we go to a new sheet, a brand new sheet, of course that information will be gone, and I'll show you how we do that through conditional formatting. We don't necessarily need to know the last row of the data or the last column, because it's a brand new sheet. But when we select back into the products or with sheet, we do want the last row of data to show. We want the last column data, so that's important. So we need to clear out those fields. So that's important. So we need to clear all the associated fields before we load the new ones in. And again, we're going to clear the mapping data just as we did above. We're going to delete the validation just as we did above, and we're going to reset the mapping to incomplete. Right? We don't want to try to import it. Importing must be done, but only after we map the data. And we'll see if we can get to that today. But we want to make sure that we don't skip any steps. So this helps us. B61 false helps us to prevent the user from skipping steps. As soon as we complete the macro for mapping, this becomes true, and then we just run a check. And of course, we're going to reset all of the mapping to general, just as we did above. The formats, we don't know what formats they have, whether they're currency or dates or decimals or percentages. We're going to set that all back to general. Just keeps it nice and clean. Okay, next up, we've covered that. We've covered both the new workbook and the existing workbook, so we know what happens when we do those. And now let's take a look at the browse for destination workbook. This is very, very similar to the browse for select data source, but this time we're going to be using browse for destination. When that happens, all we do is we select a specific workbook, and we have the formats here. We have XLSX. We have a few different formats here that we've selected, and click OK. And what that's going to do is going to take the long file name. It's going to put it in E28. It's going to take the actual file name and put that into E29. And next up, it's going to list all of the sheets in that specific workbook. So we're going to show that, plus not only all the sheets, plus we're going to add a brand new worksheet. So we're going to, at the end of whatever list of sheets that have, we're going to add this new worksheet. So we're going to add that to the drop-down list, that dynamic drop-down list. So that's going to be added in. If there's data in the current worksheet, just as we did with the data source, I need to know about the data. I need to know what row we're starting on. I need to know if it includes headers or not. I also need to know what is the first column of the data. The first column, that's important. I need to know the last row of the data in case we're adding on to that, or maybe we're clearing it out, but I need to know where the current data is. Maybe we're going to add on to that. Maybe we need to clear it out and replace it, but it's important to last row. Same thing with the last column. I need to know that last column so that we can map the data properly. So we need to know all the parameters, all the four corners of that data, whether it's a table or non-structured table, or it's just simply data. I need to know all the information. And then I also need to know, what are we going to be doing? Are we going to be replacing the existing data, or are we going to be adding on to the existing table? That's very important. And this, of course, we may want to add on to that. So if we do, we're going to take that source data and we're going to start in row 22 and we're going to add on to that. But if we're replacing the data, we would just start on the first row of the data and clear out anything previous. So there's a lot of parameters that we need to know before we move on to the mapping data, and we do that in a macro. So let's go over that macro again and see just how. Let's go over the macro first time, although it is very similar. There's two macros we're going to focus on here, the first of which is the browse for the workbook folder. So let's do that. Into the developers tab. Also in the destination macros here, at the top of our module here, we have something called browse for destination. This macro has been assigned to this button right here. So when we right click this button and click assign macro, we will see that the macro that's been assigned is browse for destination. That is the macro that we're going to be focusing on. So the first thing we want to do, just as we did in the source, is dimension the file folder as a file dialog. I want to open that up and browse for files. So we need to dimension the file folder as a file dialog. If for some reason this creates an error, we want to make sure that you have all of the things. In the references, this is required. You will need a Microsoft Office object library. Microsoft Office library. 14.0, 15.0, 16.0. The number is not so important, but you want to make sure that you have a Microsoft Office. If for some reason you see this missing, just browse down here to any Office library and make sure you select it. And unselect anyone that might be missing. Keep that in mind. If you have run errors, that might be part of it. Okay, moving on. We also have the destination file path as a string, so that's important. And because we need to know the destination worksheet as a worksheet, and then import workbook, that's the current workbook that we're working with, the import. We need to define that as a workbook, along with the destination workbook. I need to know that as a workbook. And the worksheet row is long. We're going to run through all of the worksheets, so we need to keep track of the rows. Why is that? Just like we did in the source, we're going to do the same thing for that. So I need to know, I need to unhide this. I need to start at that worksheet row 8 and run through all of the worksheets that are in that destination workbook, and then at the bottom of that I need to add new worksheet onto that as well. So we need to run through all the sheets. So regardless of our destination workbook, we need to pull those sheets, so that we have to start at a row and then move down one row. So we have to start. What's the starting row? That's going to be row 8. That's the worksheet row. We need to track that row. So that would be worksheet rows long. The first thing we want to do is set the current workbook to this workbook, import workbook. We need to make sure we understand the difference between individual workbooks. So we want to make it nice and clear which workbook is which. And our first workbook, before we even pull any other workbook, we're going to set the current workbook, which is the import workbook, to this workbook. Okay, with sheet 1, that is the sheet that we're focused on. That's the only sheet that we're working with in this particular one for at this point. So we want to set B8 through B100 clear. What does that do? Those clears all the other source worksheets. When we're pulling up a new workbook, we want to clear any sheet, so we're going to clear all of that out. That's important, so to clear all that out. And also I want to clear any summary message. This is just a summary message in the summary that is here, because if there's an import summary, there would be some summary message here from a previous import. I want to clear that out as well. This is use conditional formatting to change that to what? I'll show you a little bit later. So there might be a message here. I want to clear that out. That would be E47 to I53. That's a merge cell, so we need to make sure when we're clearing content, we need to clear all of the cells in that range, E47 through I53. That is a merged cell. So we want to make sure that we do that as well. All right, so again, we want to clear all the E8 all the way to the 100, so we can clear that out. So we can clear all the worksheets out, so we get ready to put some brand new worksheets in. All right, next up, we also want to delete, again, the mapping data and validation. We've been over this line before and a few others. I just want to clear any mapping data so that when we do run the map, it's brand new. We're going to set the worksheet row as 8. That's the first row where our sheet will go. Set initial worksheet row to 8. Then we're going to open up the file dialog, set the file folder equal to application.file dialog, MSO file dialog file picker. This file picker is going to allow us to pick a file picker. And we need to get a title for that. We're going to click select destination file. That's going to be our title for that file dialog. And we're going to allow these forms. In fact, we can add one more just as we did previously. So we can add comma star XLS, star dot XLS. So we can add XLS as well. We want that in case you have older versions of Excel that you have a destination file. I'll save that just so we can record those changes. Then we say if there's no selection, if the user has not selected anything, if they cancel out of that dialog, what I want to do is I want to skip everything. So that'll skip all this and go to no selection and just activate the current workbook. Moving on, if they have selected them, I want that entire file name to go into E28. The entire file name should go in E28. That is a long file name, so it's going to take whatever the user has selected and put that long file name right there in E28. Now we're ready to define the path. We know the destination file path, that full file path, is in E28. It's going to put that full file path right here, E28, which is the full one. And next up, I want to use directory and define just the name and put that into E29, just the file name into E29. So E29 equals the directory of the destination file path, and I want to know the VB directory. That'll take just the file name and put it there. That's going to help us. Next up, what I need to do is I need to run a check and see if the workbook is open already. If it is, then we can just set it. If it's not, we need to open it up. Right? I need that workbook open because I need to pull the sheets. I need to check for data. So there's a lot of things I have to do. So we want to make sure if, like for example, it's open right now. You see it's open. Here's my destination. It's open. But what if I browse for it and open again? It could create an error, right? If I try to set the workbook that's not open, it's going to create an error. So if it's open, it will not create an error. But we're going to, so that we get around this by doing two things. We're going to set this. We're going to set the destination workbook equal to workbooks and the direction. If the workbook, if this is not open, this would create an error. Let me show you. I'm going to comment this out, and then I'm going to close the destination workbook, right? Close that out. And now what we're going to do is we're going to browse for that, browse the destination, and click OK. And that's going to create a bug. Let's take a look at that. Here's what we're trying to do. I'm trying to set the destination workbook, but it's not open. Right. This is a test, though. This way we can avoid whether it's open or not. We can use these few lines of code to automatically get around. So let's say there was an error. We have on error resume next. So this is creating an error. But since we have, so what we're going to do is we're going to skip this line if it's not open. So that means if the destination is nothing, that means it's not open, then set it and then open it at the same, we're using the same line of code. This line of code does two things. It sets it and it opens it. So we have that. But these three lines are only going to come, it's only going to be done if it's nothing. So that's why we're allowed to do with on error resume next, it allows us to do just that. So again, when I run this macro and I browse for the destination, And now that I've commented, it's automatically going to open up only if it's not currently open. So these few lines of code, basically what it does, it allows us to open a workbook if it's not open, and it sets the workbook whether it's open or not. Okay, so then once we can set the destination workbook. We're ready to set the destination workbook. We don't need this anymore because we have set it up here or here. All right, so now for each worksheet in the destination workbook worksheets, for each sheet, now we're going to be running through the sheets. What do I want to do with the sheets? Well, I want to take each sheet name and I want to put it starting at B8 and going down. Starting at B8 and going down each sheet. And then once we're done, I want to put new worksheet at the bottom of that. So we can do that with just a few lines of code. For each sheet in each destination worksheet in the destination workbook worksheets, what do I want to do? Sheet 1, why do we need sheet 1 here? We don't have it up here because we're working with for each sheet 1. So I want to make sure to define sheet 1 because it's focused on worksheets right now. Sheet 1, B and the worksheet row equals the destination worksheet name. Destination worksheet name. Put the name of each worksheet, and for each one, increase the row 1, so the row goes down. Now that's these lines of code for every worksheet. So it's going to run until all the worksheets in that workbook have been listed in column B, starting in 8 and moving down. Once that's done, on whatever worksheet row is, we've already added one for the next one. So whatever the last one is, the first of last available one, we're going to add new worksheet to them. So that's going to add the ability to give the user to create a brand new worksheet, put that data in a new worksheet. So we give them that option. Okay, next up, we're going to set the initial sheet name. I want to make sure that whatever's the first worksheet in that workbook, I want to put that, whatever's been in B8, I want to put that in I-29. So what that's going to do is going to take whatever's in B8 and put it here right in I-29 right here. I-29. So I want to put that initial sheet right there. So that's very important. I want to put that there so that it gives them, and now, so what we have is we have all the sheets, including sheets 2, 3, and 4, and the new worksheet. So the destination workbook already has 4 sheets, but the ability to add a new worksheet as well. And so if we look at that data, the destination worksheet, we'll see that there's 4 worksheets: product, sheet 2, sheet 3, and sheet 4. So we have those already. And if we click on a specific sheet, it's going to give us the information. Now we've gone through, let's continue on down. So that's it. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to make sure, because when we open the destination worksheet, that particular workbook is going to be present. But I really don't want to look at this worksheet. I want to look at this one. So we have to run just one line of code saying this workbook activate. That's going to activate the import workbook because that's the one we're focused on. All right, so now we have all the information in it. We've browsed it, but what do I want to do now? Now what I want to do is I want to get information into these columns, and it really depends on what worksheet we select. So we've got products here, but what if we select another sheet? I want those individual information to change automatically. So for example, if we have sheet 3, the first row of data, because if there's data in the specific sheet, I want it to change based on that. So we actually have to run another macro based on a change on the destination worksheet. Based on this change, we want to run a macro. So let's take a look at that macro right now. The first thing is we're looking at a change to I-29. So when we make a change to I-29, we want something to happen. Into the developers, we're going to make a worksheet change. So let's take a look at the data map. When we change to I-29 here, worksheet change, if the intersection target range is nothing, if there's a change to I-29, we want something to happen. We're going to run this macro right here, get destination data. That's the macro that I want to get all the information and puts it in those fields. So back into the module destination macros. And if we scroll down here, we see I have a macro called get destination data. And what's the purpose of this? Let's review that just again. When I change the sheet, I want to put in the first row of data. I want to know what the first row of data is. I want to know what the first column of data. I want to know what the last row of data, and I want to know the last column of data. I want to know all that information because if we have to add to it or if we're going to map the data, we need to know all of the information. Sheet 2 is blank. products is not. So we need to know all the information in our destination file. In our destination, I must know if there's existing data. I must know when the first column of data is. I want to know the last row, how many columns of data, and what the first row of data is. So I want to know that. If sheet 2's got nothing, sheet 3 has data, sheet 4. So we need to pull that information in if we're going to be adding to that, or we're going to be adding below the headers. That's really critical information. So when we need to pull that up, we're going to use a macro to do just that. So inside this macro, we need to define a few things. First of all, we need to know the destination file path as a string, and I need to know the destination sheet name. That's important. We also need to know the destination workbook and, of course, the current workbook as a workbook. So we're going to define those and dimension those as workbooks. Again, the worksheet row, we need to know that. The first row, what's first row, and the table row and the table column. All those are long. We're going to be focused on those tables. We're going to use those in our code, and that's very, very similar to the source data we covered in part 1. And the first column is long, the last row in the last column. So these are all variables based on the current data inside that destination worksheet. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set the import to the current workbook. We always want to make sure we know what the current workbook is. Set that up with sheet 1, and we're going to focus again. We're going to clear the mapping data just as we've done. We're going to delete the validations, reset formulas. All this is the same type of code that we've been over a few times before, and to clear the import. So that's just basically clearing it, because when we add new worksheets, when we add new workbooks, when we add new sources, it's basically like resetting the entire import process. So we need to do it all over again if we change the source, or if we change the destination, or if we change the destination worksheet. All of that has to be cleared out so that we can redo the whole process once again. It's very important, so we need to run through that. Next up, I need to determine whether we're on a new workbook or a new worksheet. New workbook or new worksheet. So we need to make sure that for the first if statement is this an existing workbook or an existing worksheet? Here there's two things. One, does this say new worksheet here? That would be I-29, or is B4 1? Remember, B4 is 1. 1 signifies an existing workbook. So what in this first if then statement, I want to focus on just existing workbooks and existing worksheets. Existing workbooks would be 1. Existing worksheets would be here, anything that says not new worksheet. So that's the first if statement. 2 conditions. I really want to focus on the existing sheets for existing workbooks. So in that case, we're going to do an if statement. If B4 equals 1, and of course that would mean existing workbook, and 2 conditions, range I-29 does not equal new worksheet. So those are the 2 conditions. We need to make there's actual worksheet, not a new worksheet. So if those 2 conditions, then do something. And then we have an else down here. Else would be if it's a new workbook or new worksheet. So we're going to focus on just the existing here. So all this has to do with existing, right? Existing. So the first thing we want to do for that if statement is right here. Also I need to know if E28 is empty or E28 equals no. I just want to make sure that there's no workbook selected. So if E28 is empty or E28 value equals new workbook, then exit the sub. Just in case, we're going to exit out just to make sure that there's E28 is the long file path, and make sure that there's no new workbook, just in case, because we don't want to continue down if all that's just in case we put that down. But it should not. The destination file path is E28. We need to make sure that we have a valid workbook file path that's stored in E28. Next up, we want to open. I need to make sure that workbook's open. So the first thing we're going to do is set the destination to make sure that the workbook is open. If the workbook is not open, it's going to create an error. So that's why we have on error resume next. So then we can just simply check our next statement. If the destination workbook is nothing, if it's nothing, that means it's not open. So then in that case, set it and open it based on that path. So that'll open it. So just in case it's open, it runs. Now we're ready to set the sheet name. The sheet name that the user has selected is the one in I-29. That is the sheet name, I-29 right here. So we need to define that because we're going to be working with that sheet specifically. So we can focus on just that workbook, the destination workbook, and just that sheet. So with the destination workbook and with that specific sheet, we need to do a few things. The first thing I want to do is I want to get the last row of data. And again, we can do this just as we did in the source. We're going to define the last row and of cells, dot cells, because we've already defined the workbook and the sheet. So now all we need to do is cells. And we're going to use find. We're going to find any text, any type of text, anything that's been in there after A1. So after A1, we're going to look everything after that, and we're going to look at part of it. We're going to look in the formulas. We're going to search order by rows. I'm going to search direction previous, match case. The case doesn't matter. And I want to take all that, look for it, and I want to pull the row. I want to get the row out of that. That's going to tell us what the last row of, and it's going to put it right in here in the last row. And I'm going to do the same exact thing for last column, except we're going to end this with column. And what does that do? That's going to tell us our last row. We need to know the last row right here. So in this case, for our destination, for if we have, let's take a look at, we have products. So let's pull up the products here. And the products would tell us our last row is 21 and our last column is J. Our last column, and what is J? J is column 10. So our last column is 10. So products 21 and 10 are the fields. That's the information that I want in here. So the last row 21, the last column 10. So that's very important. We need to pull that out, and I need to define that. So that's automatic. So we do that in the code. So we've gotten those variables filled. We have last row and we have last column. Next up, what I want to do is I want to determine the first row of the table. And we can use that. In fact, let me make that 70%, but it really doesn't matter. You can use 70 or 75. But what I want to do is I've done this exactly in the source. If you've gone through the source training, you'll realize that we did the same thing for the source. And that was basically, we're going to run from the first to the last row, and I'm going to look and I'm going to count. I'm going to run a count for a specific number of text that is greater than 70%. What is that? That's the row. So let's look down here. I'm going to go through each row in our destination. This row has one value. There's 1, 2. We have 7 columns. There's one value. So 1 divided by 7 is going to be like 15 or so percent. So that's not going to be enough. I'm looking for something over 70%. This one, there's not. If I count all the values in this row, it gets 0. So that's not. But what if I count all the values in this row? We're going to be at 100% because there's 7 different values from the row to the last row. 7 different values on this row, and they all equal. So 7 divided by 7 is equal 100%. So I use a division to determine that. Let's focus that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to count all the cells in the table row. I'm going to use column 1 through the last column, We're going to count all of them. In this case, it's going to be table row, whatever row we're on. So we're going to loop through the rows. Row 1 has just one value, row 2, row 3. So we're going to keep going through until we get something that's greater than 70%. And we're going to divide that by the last column. That is going to tell us that it's greater than 70%. So that's going to help us determine that we have 100%. So that's very, very important. So we can determine what total number of filled cells, and it helps us determine what the first row is. And we can pretty much, so we're going to do, once we have figured out it's greater than 70%, you can use whatever percentage you want. We're going to set that to the first row. That's going to tell us our first row. It could be a header row, so that's important. And then we're ready to exit. Once we have something greater than 70%, we can exit out of that. And I'm going to do the same thing except for columns. What I want to do is I want to know the first column. That's probably equal to 50%. That means, what that means is I want to know the first column that has all of that data in there. In our destination, our first column has nothing in it, so that's our second column has nothing in it. So I'm going to go through all the columns, and you can see this column, maybe if it's half full or more than half full, we know that that's going to be our first column of data. So we're going to count all the values from row 1 all the way, and we're going to go through each column until we find something that's greater than 50%. That's going to help us determine what our first column of data is. So, and it's not an exact science, but it's going to get us close in most cases. User may have to adjust that from time to time, but they may have to adjust these percentages, or as an admin or a programmer, you might have to adjust these, but the user can also adjust the row in case it's different than something that's been calculated. So again, once we know that the columns that's greater than 50%, we can then set the first column to the table column and exit out of that. That's going to determine our first row and our first column of the table, or pretty close to it. So now that we have those values, we can move on. For the existing destination workbooks with headers, add 1. So if there's a header, we need to add 1, right? If I want to know the first row, it's going to return 3. So far we said, okay, 3. 3 is the first row. What I really want is the first row of data. I want the first row of data. So if the user has said that their data includes headers, data has headers if this. And what is this? If we right click this option box here, we can see this checkbox here. We can see that that's connected to B6. So if we take a look at B6 and unhide these, and we take a look at B6, we'll see that B6 is true. So if the data has headers, B6 is going to be true. So if the data has headers, if our first row of data is 3, but our data has headers, we need to add 1 and make it 4. So we do that with this line of code. If B6 equals true, that means the user has said, yes, I have headers, and B4 equals 1. What is B4? And then B4 is the existing destination for workbooks with headers. B4. What is B4? Let's take a look at that. B4 is, of course, an existing workbook. We want to make sure that it is an existing workbook. So if both of those are true, then we want to make sure that we add 1 to the first row of data. Add 1, that'll set us. So in this case, we know that the first row is found, so this first row of actual data is on 4 and our headers are located on 3. That's going to help us in case we want to replace all the data. We're going to clear this data out and just put the new data in here, but we want to make sure the headers stay right where they are. So that line of code helps us to do that. We can then first row equals first row plus 1. We're just simply adding though, because I want to know the first row of data. I don't want to know the header row. All right, next up, all we need to do is take those variables and put them inside the cells. F31 is going to be where our first row. F33 is going to be our last row. 32 is going to be our first column. J32 is going to be our last column. So that's where all the data goes. Again, the F31 is going to be our first row of data. F32 is going to be our first column of data. Our last row is going to be on F33, while our last column of data is going to be located on J32. So we've got all those 4 variables in there, and that's really going to help us out for our data mapping. It's very important that we get the mapping accurate so that when we do the mapping, we can then make sure that all of our columns are exactly accurate. Okay, and again, we have column C. As we change this, let's finish up with this workbook before we go. Okay, else, what if it's a new workbook? What if it's a new workbook or a new worksheet? New workbook or a new sheet. Remember, if we started off with if here, if it's an existing workbook, B4 would be 1. If it's a new worksheet, of course, we're not going to continue on. But if either one of these are true, then we're going to go all the way down here to else. This would be a new destination workbook or a new worksheet. Of course, those would be the same. Then we're just going to set the defaults. I'm just going to set some automated. I want the first row of data in, let's say, row 2. The last row of the destination, that would just be 1, because that's fine. That won't matter. Set the first column of the destination would be 1, and the last column 1. We can just set those last to 1, but they're not that important because there's no data in there, so it won't matter. When we do the mapping, it won't matter what the last row of data or the last column of data. And of course, what if the I-29 equals new worksheet, then I-30 equals new sheet. I just want to set a default for the new sheet. I want to give the user the ability to rename the brand new sheet. So if it's a new worksheet, I want to give the user the ability to do that. And they have the ability. So for example, when we click new worksheet, I want to give the user the ability to click to change the name of whatever this sheet's going to be, and we can do that. Now this is use conditional formatting. Let's take a look at the conditional formatting. If we go into the home and click conditional formatting and manage rules, we see this one conditional formatting affected on this cell. And when we edit the row, we'll see I-29. As long as it does not equal new worksheet, then I want to hide it. And I can hide it by changing both the font and the background color. So of course the font color will be the same as the background, and then the fill color will be the same exact color. So taking the font and the background color is going to hide it. So that means anything that's not a new worksheet is automatically going to hide it. Use conditional formatting and it hides both of those. And if we highlight that, you can see that it's there, but it's just hidden because I really only want to define that new worksheet name when the user has selected new worksheet. So that's when I really want to show it. So we use conditional formatting to hide that. Okay, so continuing on, we're just about done with this specific macro. And if now the next is we're going to reset the mapping complete false. Of course, if we check the new sheet, we need to remap it. We remember we cannot continue to our fourth step until we've done our third step. So this allows us to do that. If range A6 value equals true, then first row. So again, we're going to say if the user has said that there's headers, we want to add the first row. We also want to do this as well, just in case. I want to make sure that that's set up. Okay, we don't need that. All right, so next up, we want to activate the workbook, and that's it. And then, of course, if there's a missing destination, I just want to put that here in case there's a missing destination, in case the workbook is missing. All right, we're going to activate the workbook. We've done all of the work with our destination workbook. We just want to activate it. So we're good with that. All right. We are set up with that. Let's focus on some of the conditional formatting because we've got a lot. If we take a look, and we've got some conditional and some formulas, and we went over this formula. Let's take a look at this formula. What I want to do is, let's actually pull up products so we can see additional. I want to know the first column of data. I want to show what is the first column, and I want to show column C so it's clear. We went over this formula. We'll go over it quickly. What I'm going to do is pull the address. I want the row 1, and I want the address based on the column of F32. In this case, it's column 3. And what I want to do is I want the absolute number. This 4 means it's an absolute, not an absolute. It's relative, meaning there's no dollar signs that's going to show up on the address. Once I get the address, in this case, it would be C1. C1. I want to remove the 1. I want to remove the 1. This will return C1, but I want to remove the 1. I only want to show C. So how do we do it? We use substitute. Substitute is going to take C1 and it's going to look for the 1 and it's going to replace it with empty spaces. So that is going to give us just 1, just C. And if I take that and I add in column and then the open parentheses, and then I close it with the closed parentheses here in quotes, it's going to give me that column C. It's going to tell me. So as soon as I change it to something else, it's going to automatically change to whatever column. And this allows the user to know exactly what column they're on. So it's a really, really handy trick. And I only want this information to show up when we have a specific sheet. If we have a new worksheet, of course, the last column is not going to matter. So we use conditional formatting for that. So if we highlight this and go into conditional formatting and we click manage rules, we see we've got a conditional formatting. So let's take a look at this. Edit if B4 equals 2. What is that? That means new workbook. 1 would be an existing workbook. 2 means new workbook. So if it's a new workbook, or I-29 equals worksheet. So a new workbook or new worksheet, I want to hide. I don't need to know the last row of data. I don't need to know that because it's a new workbook or it's a new worksheet. So in that case, again, I want to format it. I want to put a background color of light blue, and I want a font of light blue. That's going to hide whatever text is there. And that's only for those two conditions, new worksheet or new workbook. So if we click new workbook, it's also going to be hidden. But if we click use existing workbook, and this is blank, of course, we want to show it so that the user can browse for the destination workbook. And we click the destination workbook, again, it's going to show. I want to show that. And the same thing here. If the last column is 10, I want to show that as well. But if it's a new workbook, the last one won't matter, right? We don't need to know if there's a new workbook or a new worksheet. And again, if we click on the destination and we click a new worksheet, again, it's going to disappear. So again, if we click on the conditional formatting, we're going to see the same exact rules. Again, B4 equal 2, meaning it's a brand new workbook or a new worksheet, hide it. Again, background, the color of the font would be blue. The fill color would also be the same color blue, and that's going to hide it automatically. Okay, so we've gotten a lot, we've understand exactly why, and now we have this new sheet. We have the ability, because it's a new worksheet, but again, I've explained to you that it's going to go. And imported, we also want to hide and show this. If it's imported, it should add to existing data or not. But this, of course, if we're going to be adding to the existing data, we only need that on existing worksheets. We wouldn't add to existing data on a new worksheet, right? So we also have conditional formatting for this. Again, conditional formatting manage rules, and we'll take a look at it again. If B4 equals 2, if it is in a new workbook, or if it is a new worksheet, we're not adding to existing data, right? We don't want to give the user the option to add to existing data when there's no data on the worksheet. Again, so we're going to use the same format, same color font, same color background to hide that, because we only want to show that. Because there's a lot of options here, so we don't want to show all the options if they're not needed. We don't want to show existing data if it's an existing worksheet. We only want to hide this option when they've selected a new worksheet, so we can easily hide it. We only want to show options when they apply. We want to hide other options when they don't apply. So that's really, really important. And of course, we also have the ability, this macro here is going to give us to the map data. And again, when we click on the assign macro, it's off the screen, sorry about that, and I'll bring it up. Import step 3, this is going to take us to import step 3. Okay, so that's going to allow us to simply click next and go to the mapping area. So we've covered a lot. Let's review on what we have covered. We've covered the destination. We've covered the ability to have an option of import into a new workbook or to an existing workbook. We've covered how to browse for an existing workbook, and of course how to title that and how to filter based on certain formats. Click on it and select it. We've also covered how to get the full file name into the destination file along with just the regular file name there, and we've also covered how to list all the worksheets and add possibly a new worksheet. We had a lot of conditional formatting here based on whether it's a new workbook, an existing workbook, or a new worksheet, or an existing worksheet. We've also covered how to cover column C. We have also covered whether we're going to add a first row based on whether the data has headers or not. And so we've also covered in the code a lot of that too. In the code, we did cover a few macros as far as what macros are covered for existing workbooks and what are for new workbooks. So we've done that, a lot of that. We've covered a lot of that in this part 2 of the training. In part 3, we're going to cover mapping the data and how we map data and how we are able to automatically set formats based on a user selection here. It's going to be a great training in part 3. We've got a lot to cover. Thanks for your patience, and I hope you have enjoyed this training. Of course, if you have not yet, please go ahead and subscribe to our channel and click the notifications. I bring you brand new videos each and every Tuesday using Excel in ways you cannot imagine. Every week's a big surprise on how I create this. Also, these videos are free, so we do love your support if you can help us out we have amazing products, including a 100 workbook package zip file. That's just $37 for right now. So if you want to grab that, the price might go up soon, so you may want to get that right away. We also have an amazing Excel resource guide, 1,000 Excel resources. That includes 100 PDFs along with 100 free Excel courses and 100 paid, and a ton more, including utilities and add-ons. Also, of course, the 15-hour Excel single-click dashboard masterclass. Hundreds and hundreds of students are enjoying that and getting brand new freelance jobs because of everything they're learning in that course. All right, thanks so much. We'll see you in part 3. Much appreciated. Have a great day.